Okay, Teaching the Distributive Property to Struggling Math Learners by Lysiak, ADIT 6170. Something I want to point out before I move forward is that I purposefully added the Struggling Math Learners section in here of my title because teaching the distributive property to students who are on level or even advanced in 7th grade is a very different process and a different lesson planning process than teaching it to struggling math learners. The group that I made this lesson for specifically all failed the milestone in math last year and go through remediation math every day on top of the math class that they are in with me. So I have the job of not just teaching the new math curriculum, but then also reteaching prior math curriculum to make sure that they are able to get what we are working on current day. So an overview of the lesson that I put together is that I had my starter, which was a very quick write on properties because they didn't remember a whole lot of them. We reviewed the 4 properties that they should have learned from 2nd through 6th grade. We went through, we talked about, we practiced the properties of operations doing a matching sheet. I used we took notes on the distributive property. We did whole class error analysis, and then they did a Desmos card sort for a formative assessment. So their starter was exactly this. I asked them to write down any information they remembered about the associative, the identity, the commutative, and the zero properties. And I challenged them to include both words and numbers, which was something very difficult for them. It took a lot of prompting. A lot of them were able to show an example, let's say for the zero property, but were not able to put into words why it was the zero property. So that was really the main one that students could remember at all. The other ones they definitely struggled to even remember, and I had some students who even told me they'd never heard those words before. So while I don't believe that's the case, I do believe that they didn't remember the words at all. So it was definitely something that we needed to do before we got to trying to use the distributive property. So we then jumped right in and did glue-in notes. So each student had a piece of paper, they folded it in half, they had to cut down it and glue it into their notebook. While they were doing that, we were making an anchor chart at the same time. I was writing up an anchor chart. I did this so that they had both their own notes as well as guided notes from me. A lot of students require that and really struggle with note taking. So by modeling it up on the board, what they should also be doing in their notebooks, and then also having that somewhere for them to glance at if need be for the review is something that I find really helpful with them. We went through and determined, based on those 4 properties, a numerical example, a 7th grade friendly definition, and the algebraic equations representing that property. And they actually they formulated all of that information, and I was just their scribe and helped them kind of pare it down to a way that would be nice for having in their notes, something they could refer to again. But this is not information that I gave them. This is information I prompted from them to give to me. They then went and did a properties of operations matching sheet. They did this with their tables. So they were on Table Talk and they had help with their partners. They were able to go through, this was a 2-sided sheet, and match the expressions. Now you'll notice in the directions on the sheet that it says there are some that they hadn't discussed yet. That's actually not true because at that point they had already had review, whereas the other classes that were doing this sheet had not. So that direction was really for those other classes, but quite frankly none of my students picked up on it anyways. So they went through more so and identified what each one was. We then went through it together. I asked them to finalize 10 of the, I believe, 18 options. So I wanted them to find and identify at least 10 that they felt confident about so that we could go through, and I really liked giving them that choice on doing that, and it made them feel a lot more confident to be able to skip one and not be penalized for it. A lot of those students have really low grades and are very grade conscious and don't want a bad grade, and it really gives a lot of them anxiety. So even though I wasn't taking it for a grade, they were still anxious about having so many problems to do and potentially be graded on it. After we went through and we did all of that, we talked about the notes. We moved on finally to the notes, which was step one really of this lesson, if you think about it, to get to the distributive property. So we went through, we had our vocab, they put it in their notebooks. We used area model, which is something 8th grade teachers have, I heard, are noticing that students who have mastered area model are a lot better with their properties than students who have not. So that's something I wanted to really focus on with them. And then we used, we had them create their own area model, trying to determine if you could use the distributive property to expand an expression with subtraction and not just addition. We then went through, they practiced 1 through 4 using expanded form. We came back together, checked answers, and then they practiced doing factored form. Same thing, came back, checked answers. We then did error analysis. They did just one on the board. They didn't see both of them at the same time. This is just for the sake of this PowerPoint. And they went through and they had to identify where the error was from a different kid from a prior year. And this is really important for them to be able to see that students make errors and then to be able to pick out where their error was. So hopefully our students don't do it as well. And there's a lot of research that backs error analysis. So that's a great thing for them to be doing right now. Lastly, for their formative, I had them do a Desmos card sort. This is my first time actually using a card sort on Desmos, and I loved it. I was able to see all of my students' answers up on the board in real time, but it didn't identify them by name. It identified them by a mathematician's name, which was great because the students were able to identify their own screen up on the board, but didn't know who else was up there. So we could look at things where it went wrong and also where it went right and not embarrass a child. Lastly, I also love this bogus section of Desmos where we could see students had to also pick out ones that didn't fall into any of those properties, which again, just like the error analysis, is something that's really helpful to have that extra section where they need to identify where things are wrong, which is not something that they often have to do, but in math can be really helpful. So going through these lessons, the final results, I do feel like my students walked away knowing the distributive property, which was my ultimate goal. I do feel like it took us a lot longer to get there than I initially expected, and I think that that's the norm for this class and for a lot of classes, is it just takes more time than you realize. And going through, I really had initially planned for 2 days for this lesson, and it took me about 4, which is an issue when it comes to timing-wise on our pacing calendar, but at the end of the day, I feel that I did what was right and best by my kids, and that's all that matters. I do think that when it comes to revising this in the future, I think that the number of problems, for example, on the very first worksheet they did could have been cut down. We didn't need 18 of them. It wasn't necessary for them to get the point. I also think that exposing them to the difference between the property of addition and the property of, let's say, multiplication, and how these are different, and reviewing that, even though they know addition and multiplication, being able to recognize it was a different story, and that was definitely something they struggled with. Lastly, with the Desmos card sort, I ended up not being able to take that as a formative grade because students didn't all have their Chromebooks, and so some had to work collaboratively, and I wasn't able to really recognize individual students' work. So I do feel like moving forward, I would also have some other way for students to do this, maybe on paper, maybe cut it out myself and have them group the little sheets of paper together. Just something else for them to be able to participate on their own so I can see their work without it being collaborative, so I can really see who truly did and didn't grasp it. Overall, I am happy with how my lesson went though, and I'm very pleased with my student engagement, particularly with the anchor charts. I'm noticing that's made a huge difference. I've only recently started doing those the last few weeks, and the students have really responded well to having that guided set of notes up for them while they're trying to take their own as well. Thank you very much.